or PPA, whose mission is to promote in a nonpartisan, educational, and cooperative manner the health, safety, and general welfare of the neighborhood, and to promote the maintenance and improvement of the aesthetic, residential, and physical qualities of the neighborhood environment. The other group is the Prospect Park Anti-Racist Organization, or PAPARO, as I call us in my head. We're an informal group of neighbors that fosters conversation and hopes to inspire action on anti-racism in the Prospect Park neighborhood. And so assuming we're all here because we feel passionate in some way about public safety, community safety. And so this past year, 2020, opened the door to a lot of new possibilities. And as we've said in previous sessions, 2021 does present us with the opportunity to step through this door of new opportunities. So with the murder of George Floyd and our ongoing reckoning with longstanding racism, this has forced us as a city to answer difficult questions like who keeps us safe? What role should police play in public safety? If any, what does it mean to be safe in the first place? What does it mean to build community? So in this workshop series, we'll be exploring these questions among others, guided by presentations from local community organizers, activists, and advocates. And after their presentation, we'll have time for Q&A before breaking out into small groups for some facilitated discussions, or there may be a time during the presentation for facilitated discussions. We can figure that out when it comes. I believe Grace maybe has a point in the presentation for that. So our tech czar, Sam, can maybe make the breakout groups in advance just in case we do that during the presentation. And then at the end, we'll regroup for a final round of discussion to maybe share out what we talked about in small groups. And then if there are additional questions, if there's time for the presenters, we'll have more Q&A. Before we begin, we are going to set some group norms for this afternoon. All right, thank you, Sam. All right, so these norms are to help set a safe space for this discussion. So one being one mic, one voice, meaning that only one person should speak at a time. If you do have questions for the presenter, we actually have a chat moderator, so you're welcome to share those in the chat, and then they will ask your questions to the presenter. So we will make sure your question is heard. We also have step up, step back, meaning please be aware of how much you're speaking. We also encourage everyone to use I statements, so speak from your own experience and be aware not to invalidate the experience of others. We also want to put relationships first in this work. So we want to work to build community and trust with an awareness of power dynamics. Please assume best intentions only. So we're going to assume people are speaking with the best intentions, but don't assume anything else about their experiences. We want to encourage all of us to challenge ideas and not the person stating the idea. So if anyone says something incorrect or offensive, call them out on that politely. We want to call people in to this work, and then kind of along that same vein, lean into discomfort. So on the flip side, be willing to be corrected and experience some discomfort during discussions and learn from it, and accept and expect non-closure. Please note that if you are violating these norms, we may send you a warning, mute you, or ask you to leave the group. We certainly have not had an issue with this so far, so we have high expectations. But we just want this workshop to be a safe and respectful space for all participants who come here to learn. So thank you for being here. We appreciate you taking the time. I'm going to now pass it off to our wonderful presenters from Powderhorn Park Neighborhood Association. We have Tabitha Montgomery, who is the executive director. And then we also have Grace Berke, community coordinator. So you are free to take it away.
Excellent. I'm going to get my screen sharing here. Okay, so I'll let Tabitha get us started on this first slide here, and then we'll kind of go back and forth. How about that?
Sounds great to me. Just want to really thank everyone for allowing us to be in this space with you today. Certainly, we believe that we can adhere to all the norms that you've set down, and so we appreciate you establishing them. Ultimately, this slide is just to kind of look at or give some insight to what we're hoping to cover today. And so there's 3 core pieces to our presentation or our conversation, which we believe will be at some point a dialogue in the small groups. which is to talk about shared accountability for what we mean by transforming public safety, or efforts to transform public safety, or to look at public safety through a variety of different lenses. Really wanting to emphasize the importance of data, and that's not just quantitative crime statistics or disparity reports about what various facets make our community healthy, but also qualitatively what we're hearing and what we know as some of the key themes in our community. And outside of letting qualitative and quantitative insights guide what we think about in terms of shared accountability, meaning everyone in our community having a role to play in support of improving community health that fosters livability and safety in a variety of ways. We just want to humbly say that we certainly recognize that there are other ideas. We as an organization are trying to be open to ideas inclusive of persons who believe in reform only, inclusive of those who are calling for defunding, inclusive of those who would call for abolishing structures that they believe do not serve us. We ultimately believe as a neighborhood organization that all the voices calling for change to improve community health overall serves us all over time, right? And so we're not here to judge anyone's perspective or to assert that our views or perspectives or what we heard are more important than others. So again, we thank you for your time, and those are the three things that we really hope to cover.
Thanks, Tabitha. So first of all, when we talk about responsibility and accountability, we really want to help distinguish some of the different players here in this movement or this experience that we're having in Minneapolis right now, and identify the different ways that people are responsible and accountable. So we've seen the city has already taken some big steps and made some assertions and some promises and some moves really to begin changing this work. So they have their transforming community safety body of work. You can find information about it online, but it's aimed at doing some community engagement and hearing community voices and getting information from a lot of sources to transform what community safety looks like in Minneapolis. Other examples include some of the moves that they made in the 2021 budget with the Safety for All budget amendments that led to alternative responses for mental health related calls, etc. But along with that, there's also some key responsibilities and accountability that we as community members have to be part of this process as well. And one is to use our voice, to engage in the city's process, to advocate, to have conversations with our neighbors and with each other, and to think and talk about this issue. And the other one is to really think deeply internally and do some internal reflection about how you can adapt your own behaviors and your own experience, the way you walk through the world to help transform the way that you're both experiencing and practicing safety. I think both are very important. And so we just I think most of our conversation today is going to focus on how individuals as community members can really be doing some of that internal reflection work. But we know that that's just one piece of this bigger effort, right? To reimagine what community safety looks like in Minneapolis.
And Grace, can you just hold on that slide for a second? Because the one thing that I would just want to call out is the fact that we're talking about maybe government and community in some ways from a somewhat narrow lens, right? So we're talking about specific examples of city government, but we certainly recognize that there's a role to play for every level of government, right? And then when we talk about community, we might seemingly be focused more on individuals or community-based organizations like ours, but we actually understand and acknowledge that we mean the broader community. So whether it be what can the business community do differently, and how do they think deeply about these issues, and what does large corporations do, and what do philanthropic entities do, all of the facets of community actually contribute to this moment in time right here in terms of us finding a way forward that actually moves the needle, right? Truly moves the needle on what does livability and safety mean from the lens of community health, right? There's clearly social determinants of health that many of you probably are already aware of, but really how do we make sure that our community health is the reason and at the core of how we approach livability and safety?
Yeah. So we wanted to talk a little bit about some of the data and the voices that we've heard. Some of this is over the course of this summer, as Maggie mentioned, as community members are doing a lot of reckoning and reflection. And some of it is other knowledge that we've gained over a few years of doing advocacy around public safety. So this slide in particular is from a survey that we did this summer where we asked community members about how they feel about safety in Powderhorn. And mostly I really wanted to talk about this, what makes us feel safe piece. So, you know, there are a lot of facets that go into us as individuals understanding what public safety means and what improves it. And I will certainly pass along to the planning group a resource repository that we've created of a bunch of other, you know, articles and videos and studies and research that support some of the other data behind public health approaches to public safety and some of the other things you're probably hearing about. But we just wanted to focus on what our neighbors were feeling right now. And they were clear that the top thing that improved their feelings of safety in our community was knowing their neighbors. Having relationships with the people who lived around them, having somebody that they could call if they had a question or who could help them work through a problem they might be having. And of course, you know, we know that not every situation is equal, right? There's not always going to be a perfect solution that your neighbor has. But at the same time, people found a lot of comfort in having that network and those relationships right on their block, right next to their homes. So that was a really impactful thing, I think, for us. Of course, some other things that are important to note is absence of crime, you know, being a big piece of what makes people feel safe. And that is in some ways feels obvious, but in others, you know, I think we've seen pretty steady crime rates in a lot of ways in different neighborhoods in Minneapolis. You know, I don't mean to belabor a point too much, but I think, you know, often we have a more reactive view around crime. So the crime is still happening, right? But we're thinking about how we address it when it does happen. And so the absence of crime is something we haven't quite tackled yet about how to really get that to go away. So there are other factors, of course, that community members named, but these were some of the big ones that we wanted to touch on.
And before I kind of jump into this slide, and you didn't necessarily have to go back, Grace, but I appreciate that. But I will say that we acknowledge that this is a point in time. I think Grace kind of mentioned that. This is what insight we captured over the summer through some surveying, door knocking, and outreach and canvassing. But ultimately, from a qualitative perspective, these feelings can shift, right? At some point, knowing your neighbors may not feel like enough, right? Or being at home may not feel like enough if additional investments and additional structural and systemic changes are not created that really helps to create more what we would call a holistic response to what we're dealing with as a collective community. So thanks for holding, Grace.
Yeah.
So the key themes, right, in terms of what emerged from our community is the 4 that we have up on your screen. And so there has to be an emergency response system, but many emergencies don't require police. I think that that's what we heard from our community. I think that when we say there has to be, that might feel like strong language, right? But I think that this is the reality of understanding that until we get to a different state, maybe Narnia, or there's no longer guns in the US or in the world, or that everyone operates from a place of altruism and seeking to support others, that there likely will be some type of emergency that could occur in our lives that requires a response. So there's just a simple acknowledgement that however you may at this point in your life define emergency, that there probably will be a need or an opportunity in a civil society for a system to be in place to be able to respond to any number of emergencies. And equally important is the back half of that theme, right? Is that, but currently there is wide held belief, not only from a community perspective, but what we've heard elected and appointed leaders admit, is that the police are not necessarily the right response in every emergency situation. Situations where a person with mental health challenges may come to mind is an example of that, or a person who might be clearly experiencing some form of disorientation could be because of a health condition or substance abuse or some form of trauma. The real question is, does a response is warranted that could lead to a lethal response? So caring for basic needs. I think that this is central, and I'm going to repeat that, this is central to the construct of how do we have an absence of crime? How do you get to a point where you can actually prevent crime? Oftentimes we're seeing people commit illicit or illegal activities because there's a basic need that is not being met: food, shelter, right? Or even love, right? Relationship, where people are needing to force themselves or insert themselves into the lives of someone else because they don't have relationships with other people. Knowing your neighbors, we've covered that, makes people, again, feel as if they're more connected to the community. The opportunity here is for us to have humility about who is most likely able to know their neighbor, right? People with privilege and comfort might be in a better position to know someone who cares about them than someone who might be on the margins of community because of a real struggle that they're having in their life, whether it be because of a mental health or health condition, substance abuse, or the absence of stable housing. And so then the last is this idea of prevention investments and resources are needed, right? So in addition to this idea of basic needs being met, prevention investments could truly be related to how are we ensuring that people have spaces to cultivate relationships who might be in a position or a state of being unemployed. So where does a person go, right, is a question that I would ask you to ponder. If they've been released from a emergency shelter and they've told, hey, you got to be out by 7 o'clock in the morning, where do you go between 7 a.m. after you're released and when the shelter opens back up that evening? Where and how do you build relationships? Do you have a place to use the restroom? Do you have a place to grab coffee? Do you have a place to be in community, right? We might all be hard pressed right now to believe that we know exactly all of the places where a person in that experiencing that aspect of life could go.
Just again, another thing to consider when we're talking about the data and how we understand and conceptualize public safety. On the left, you'll see these are numbers from, I believe, the budget for 2020 in Hennepin County for how they were investing in public health versus community corrections and rehabilitation, and it's per capita. Now, of course, these statistics can be analyzed in a lot of different ways. It's not as simple as, it's not an easy thing to do, but you'll see, community corrections and rehabilitation has a significantly higher investment than public health. And when we think about what that means for our community members, right, we're investing in folks after they've caused harm in our community or after they have found themselves in a place of desperation. And not as willing to invest in folks before that happens and to prevent that. So just one illustration of the way that it feels like we're hearing from community members that the balance is off, right? That there's not enough investments in prevention, and some of those resources could be moved perhaps from the reactionary to the prevention side. We also asked, again, this is from our survey that we did this summer. So like Tabitha mentioned, just a point in time feeling. But we asked community members what they would like to see happen with police in the next 2 years. So we put kind of a timeline on it so people could conceptualize a little bit better. And the number one thing we heard is first responder alternatives. Again, going back to that point that police aren't the right answer for every emergency. But we also heard a lot of people talk about redirecting significant portions of the budget towards education, housing, and jobs. Again, getting at that basic needs piece and allocating more of the police department's budget for training and accountability. So even within those resources that are spent on policing, how are we being smart and strategic about those in a way that reflects our community's values and reflects the kind of community safety that we want to have?
So a few things to consider. So how do we prepare ourselves, right? How do we begin to move the needle? And this isn't an attempt to say, these are not all the answers. These are just some things to consider. And it's about being reflective. What for you constitutes an emergency? Sometimes to begin to do the work before you find yourself in the position to make that decision is important, right? Because it helps to build the muscle. It helps to train yourself about what you think before you're faced with doing it. So right now, I am 100% ill-equipped to run a marathon. Fully ill-equipped. I don't think I could get down the block. My dog is agreeing with me. This is how much of a truth I just shared with you. Apologies for that. And then, so it's important to practice. It's important to build that muscle. And then when we talk about how do you decide when a situation needs a police response, I think that for us, we're trying to help people to think about what really feels as if a person's life, right? And this is not us telling you this is how you should apply it, but I think it really is the difference between, does someone seem to be in imminent danger of harm, right? Where we currently, even if you don't believe personally or collectively that the police should exist, there's something to be said for what do we do until Narnia or our new state of existence arrives. And some of that is relying on structures and systems that are already in place. But the difference between my neighbor is playing loud music, let me call the police. Or I hear people arguing and I think that I know what they're arguing about, let me call the police. Or I see someone suspicious on our block and I don't recognize that vehicle because I am a savant in vehicle make and models of all my neighbors, so let me call the police, right? Like somehow we magically gift ourselves with these abilities at the wrong point in time. We become superheroes, in fact, in terms of what we believe we know. And so this is just us encouraging to think critically about for you personally, not what you're hearing in chat boards and rooms about shaming or blaming about a person calling the police, but it is really for you, I think, to have an internal script about what do you believe constitutes an emergency and adhering to that as best as you possibly can.
Yeah, and so that brings us to this next slide. And I want to be clear, we're not suggesting that you could possibly imagine every emergency scenario before it happens, right? That's not how life works. I think our whole state of being would be very different if we could conceptualize every possible crisis before it arises. But I do think it's worth each of us taking some time to really do some, whether you're the type of person who writes it down or draws it or talks through it with a friend, whatever that looks like to you, take some actual time, you know, in the next month or the next week and think about what are some of the situations that you might encounter. What are some that seem realistic, right? Like property theft in your neighborhood is a realistic situation that you might encounter. You know, some are maybe less realistic, right? Like an active shooter could certainly happen, but it's not an everyday occurrence, right? How can you think about what some of those different emergencies that might arise and think about what kinds of things would trigger you needing to call the police, right? So this isn't intended to say we have the answers and this is what your sheet should say, simply to serve as an example of, for one person, the decision might be if they hear a domestic dispute, they might decide to call the police if they either A, know that there is a weapon involved or have a good reason to believe there is one, or if it's the person who's involved asks them to call the police. You know, again, it's going to be different for each circumstance. It's going to be different for each individual to really address, but I think it's important for us all to get some specifics out, think about them, and have that to turn to when you do find yourself in an emergency situation.
Right. Again, I think it sometimes goes back to old adages. Practice makes better, really not perfect, because I'm trying to lose that idea of perfect from my lexicon, quite frankly. So I'm butchering old phrases and taking you guys along for the ride, just because perfect, I think, is really in some ways a lyrical word and in some ways has more of an abusive connotation because it's as if perfect can be achieved, which I don't think exists. So what other resources or solutions are out there? So this is where we're going to enter into a little bit of a breakout. So it's kind of one of those things where we want to make sure that we're aware of what we believe are other solutions that we might be able to tap into. And then for your homework, really, which is if you choose to accept this mission or not, is to create a list of resources on your own that you can keep handy. And some, quite frankly, instances where you envision yourself being able to be a referral out in the community, meaning would you be able to direct someone to the closest battered women's shelter in your community? Would you be able to point someone to a food shelf? Would you be able to point someone to the nearest hospital or clinic if they look like they were in so need, or even recommend, if it seemed appropriate, a substance abuse facility? And let me put the biggest caveat on those examples that I could possibly give. This is not me trying to deputize any of you to go out and become mind readers about people in the community's problems, because that's not going to end up well for anybody. But this is me saying that I think that there's enough intellect, there's enough probably societal acumen that you have where you can read the room, be very cognizant of if someone is inviting you in to share those types of references or referrals, and make good decisions based on truly what you heard and not what you believe, right? In order to be able to support and resource other people. So Grace, I know that when we talked with Maggie just at the beginning, we just said that we potentially could hold the breakouts. So this is just us having, should we hold, or do we want to go right into our breakouts to have this conversation?
I think it's up to whatever folks are feeling, but I'm happy to keep going, I think, and we can hold this as part of what we can discuss together. I think that'll make the most sense ultimately. So we will certainly be able to revisit this slide before we do that if necessary, but I think we should just plug away and get to, there's not a whole lot left of our shared presentation. So
yeah, okay, great.
So with that, I mean, this is where I would encourage you to revisit your initial reflection, again, whether it be written or drawn or spoken, and add a column, as you brainstorm, what resources are there that exist in our community that aren't police for when the police aren't an appropriate response, right? So the idea is that you would maybe encounter a situation, a domestic dispute, you would decide that your triggers, your personal boundaries for when you feel a police call is warranted aren't met. And so then you might look to your non-police responses and say, do I have something here that could be helpful and useful in this situation? Do I have something that feels appropriate? And, we were planning to pose this question to this group. So I would encourage you to discuss it in your breakouts as well when we get there. Do you believe that we have all of the resources that we need, whether they be police or not, for these situations? And I think most of us, I would predict, would say that we don't currently. We don't currently have the infrastructure for the perfect or ideal response to every emergency. And that shouldn't stop us, right, from considering and trying to leverage what we do currently have, and also acknowledging that sometimes the perfect solution doesn't exist, and we might have to, even if we don't personally believe that we want to see the police department continue to exist, there might not be a better answer in that moment. But that's why it's important to do the reflection beforehand, I think, so that we're not calling police out of instinct or out of a lack of awareness of what else could be out there, but instead being intentional about how and when we use the resources that are at our disposal and that are available in our community.
And the other thing that I would say, as Grace kind of ended there, is that there is power, and I don't mean that lightly, there is real power in centering what would you do and not what someone else should do, right? When you think about even how the slight shift, right, the slightest shift in footing of this conversation, we're not in here saying what the police chief didn't do or what they didn't do or what all the people in blue did or didn't do or what city council people aren't doing enough of. Literally, this is trying to be as practical and tactical as possible about centering some of this work in a community response. And like I said at the beginning, and as Grace teed up, community for us is even broader than you. Businesses should do this. Who else should they call if they're encountering somebody that they believe is trespassing, right? Where is their list? What other things can philanthropic partners do to respond to similar questions about what is their role? Every single person and entity and structure in our community has an opportunity to help us to get untethered from the mess we find ourselves in, which is not having optimal, healthy communities for most people, especially in very extremely diverse communities, culturally diverse communities, income diverse communities, ability diverse communities, and everything in between.
Yeah. So again, this is where I just encourage you to, in your breakout conversations, think about, do you believe that all those resources exist? If not, where can you advocate for some of the resources that you've identified are missing? And if you do believe that everything you've found all of the perfect answers, then please, help share, like Tabitha was saying. And that isn't meant to be facetious or sarcastic. It's simply meant to say, rather, if you do know of a resource that's useful in a certain situation, spread the word, particularly if it's a resource that you trust and you've experienced yourself or from somebody you know directly to be helpful and useful and successful. Help make sure that other folks in your community are aware so that it can be utilized and create an impact in the community.
So here we are. This is an ongoing process, right? This isn't a do it once and you're done, ta-da, we fixed it, nothing else to see here. But we all recognize that change takes time. And I think one of the things that for me, when I think about the world as we know it today, some of the themes that comes up, this is a small tangent, but I'm going to get us right back on the track in 1 second here. Some of the things that comes up is about power, right? Position and privilege being really the central issues of our time. And I believe that this slide is in some ways challenging that to a degree, because I think it really is about really sometimes what gets in the way of structural and systemic changes is that the masses who don't have the power or maybe who don't have the wealth, which is the vast majority of our community, are not taking the time and the opportunity to figure out what are our triggers, what will we stand up for, what do I believe, how can I pivot my own behavior before spending so much time focused centrally, not that it's not important, but focused centrally on what someone outside of myself or my household should be doing. So the steps here, create a schedule to check in with yourself, because it's not create the list once, put it in the kitchen junk drawer, walk away and say, I'm glad I did that, I feel good about myself, and never to refer to it again. Get to know your immediate neighbors and share resources and understand how they like you to support them in a crisis, meaning just have a conversation, right? Don't make assumptions. Don't believe that because they're in a relationship that you wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole, you all of a sudden are an expert on what they should do. And now you're handing out literature. Now they're sneaking into their house to bring in groceries because they think you're going to hand them another pamphlet about some type of crisis center. We don't want that. We're not trying to break up happy neighborhoods, but what we are saying is that there is a way to have those conversations where you are genuinely interested in how they see their truth and not how you see their truth, right? This is really all about work that each of us can do and not making the leap to believe that we know what's best for others, right? And we understand and acknowledge that any of these things take time. Even today, I don't know if it's going to be, everyone's going to rush out and do this work, bada boom, bada bang, and we're off to the races. This is us about acknowledging that at some point, this seed, these steps, you may not revisit for another 3 months or for another 6 months. Maybe when we're in the throes of spring and summer, when we tend to find livability and safety realities a little bit more challenged, right? Because people are more mobile and more active on the streets in general. But this is to say at some point, the muscle has to be created, right? Otherwise, just like a good workout routine, you're not going to be able to get through even the first 5 minutes.
Yeah. And I would just also add, there are some obvious reasons, right, why it might be important to update your resource list, right? New resources come to be, they change, their intake processes change, or whatever the case may be. But there's also that, again, that internal work. And I think if you think about how you felt about public safety and community safety in, let's say, a year ago, like January 2020, a lot of us might feel like we've had changes in our own beliefs and opinions in that amount of time because of some of the events that we've experienced between a pandemic and a civil uprising and a brutal murder of Mr. George Floyd. So I think it's important to think about both the external ways in which your resource list changes and also the internal ways of how are you thinking about how you're going to show up in community, show up for your neighbors on a regular basis, because we know that the external factors are changing and those affect the internal as well. And that's it. That's the end of our presentation. So I think I know it sounds like typically you guys do Q&A and then breakouts. But maybe it would make more sense in this case to do breakouts, and then we can do a Q&A and kind of share about what kinds of resources and conversations were being had in the breakouts. Does that sound good?
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay. I'll stop sharing.
And I have been sort of neglecting my role as the chat monitor. There haven't really been any questions, I would say, but several comments, mostly of just appreciation and agreement. Thank you for your presentation. So one observation that at the university, university police are spending enormous amounts of time trespassing unsheltered individuals from campus buildings, which they are relying on for warmth. So just again, sort of supporting the idea of police being there to help after their help is even the wrong word, to address a problem after it's happening rather than trying to prevent it and bringing people the services they need. Somebody suggested reasonable, I think, as a substitute for perfect. And then again, just a lot of comments of appreciation. So thank you.
Well, listen, let us just say, if as people maybe need to transition before we come back from the breaks, we always appreciate positive feedback.
Okay.
We're glad everyone is finding value, or at least a little bit of the perspective we had an opportunity to share today. It means a lot, because I think it actually affirms a lot of the things that we're hearing on our side of the city.
I would like to share. My name is Aloyda. I missed last week's session, but I'm here today, and I would like to share that I plan to participate in a process, whatever that means. I was born and raised in Stadium Village, which is now called Prospect Park. Then graduated from the U of M even, and then moved away, been wherever. Now I'm back in Prospect Park. I was burglarized last week. And I'm sharing because it does relate to all of this, but this part, for me anyway, doesn't even get to, are there services, this is about the efficiency at which our systems operate for whatever purpose they serve. I reported burglary in process to 911 and had a really interesting, lengthy conversation with the person, because I came across the burglars, and it was a lengthy conversation, including just what are they doing, how did they get in there, what are they wearing, what do they look like, do they have anything, where are they going, Police never even responded. I'm here to say as I have this journey about, now I'm pissed, and I don't like it when I'm pissed, because I will work to figure out, how do I bring it to someone's attention to say, all of this work is necessary as we work at systemic internal challenges that we have. I myself want to get a hold of the 911 call, because yeah, I was mad. I was really mad, as I was saying, where in the blankety blank are they, to, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? Are you absolutely kidding me? They didn't come. Actually, I followed the culprits as they left, casually, as they meandered, and I say meandered because they were not concerned, out of my yard, in the back, around, into the parking lot, attempting to break in cars, me narrating the whole time this was going on to 911. They're using a tool now to break in. Oh no, they're going to another car. Okay, now they've walked. Oh, they stopped. Now they're having a cigarette. Got on my clothes and followed them. Don't know why I did that, but I did. Down 4th Street, up Bedford, watched as they had another cigarette, crossed over to the light rail, waited for the light rail, got on the light rail the whole time, 911 saying, ma'am, why are you following them? What do you think? Ma'am, do you see the officers? No, I don't. Then the officers did come, and I will tell you that I can take great responsibility for whatever I said when he finally got out of his car and said, how can I help you? Seriously? Have you been listening to anything that has been radioed to you and that is your best? So that's where I am today, saying there is just so much out there that I will participate in this process as I work with whomever, including the young lady who just presented phenomenally, to say, what is my right? And who do I bring this to the attention of? Because it was uncalled for. Was I fearful for my life? I don't know. I was so mad that the police never came. It was an act of robbery. And yeah, I shouldn't have followed them. But for anyone who knows me on this chat, Britt, I was pissed. And I don't even blame the culprits. I really don't. It was clear to me they were likely high. I had no worry. Hey, lady, I can tell you.
Well, Elena, thank you so much for sharing. I think that's a great transition to go into our small groups, and we can potentially
It's really
resource
not, but
share.
thank you for that.
Yes, yes. Oh, because I think, Tabitha and Grace had talked about getting to know your neighbors and resource sharing. And so this seems like a great opportunity to take advantage of that, get to know additional people in the neighborhood, and maybe they have some ideas for you. So thank you for sharing that story. I'm really sorry that
Actually, I
happened
want
to
to
you.
connect with Tabitha after. Tabitha, if you wouldn't mind, I'm going to put my name and my phone number in the chat and email, and I would like to connect with you directly.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And I'm putting in the chat, everybody's gone now, but the question, taking notes on as you talked. So for anybody still here, here's the questions that I think we can talk about.
Do still want to hear from you. So sorry if anyone else got cut off. That always happens with Zoom meetings, unfortunately. So grateful for everyone here for the perspective offered during that presentation, and also just that holistic view of talking about community and community safety. So very grateful for that. Is there anyone who would like to share some items that their group talked about?
Well, I'll share from my group report back. We actually started with the presenter's question instead of the other questions, which we talked about, well, who would we call? If we saw something going on that probably shouldn't be going on, or that we really, realized that we don't really have a lot of resources there. And someone mentioned the MPD 150 list. And we also talked about calling our neighbors to have a short conversation about what is going on here. Like, can you see what I'm seeing? And what, but then it kind of went into the fact that when you call, that we all have these assumptions of what's going on. And when you call 911, they have their assumptions, that they come with their stuff too. So, I don't know. There's not a lot of alternatives. Gee, I didn't take good enough notes to say much more, but there's not a lot of alternatives, and everyone comes with their assumptions. And yeah, we need better ways of communicating and some alternatives, other resources of where to go.
Can I tag on, Kathy?
Yes, please, because I didn't take notes.
Kathy just had a really good insight at the beginning around the issue of sort of capitalizing on that, the statement that Tabitha had made about how important it was that we call our neighbors, or that we know our neighbors, and that's often one of the first places people turn when they're unsure. And so that gives us so much power, because if we're educated and we have alternatives and we know where the alternatives are, and we know our neighbors are going to talk to each other, then that's just a real powerful place to be. That if we start learning about MPD 150 and the other things, then when our neighbors call us, we can share with them, and how just really powerful that dynamic is. And then the frustration with, in a lot of situations, those resources aren't out there for a really great alternative to the police, and that wanting to be advocating for that, to have the alternatives. And there was a bunch of examples we used about a domestic that was taking place, and that the police were called by a neighbor, but they really weren't the best solution to that. It really was needed to be something else. And another case where there was assumptions that people of color were having a drug deal, and somebody did call the police, but that's really not a good solution. So, and it was just a real powerful discussion. I really appreciate it, and the dialogue and the presentation really set it up for a really useful discussion. So thank you.
Kind of along that same vein, I feel like in our group, Tabitha brought up a very significant point about the services that police provide and whether or not they're transparent about what they actually respond to or were prepared to respond to. In the situation of the burglary, obviously that was not a helpful response whatsoever. And so looking into again, what can neighbors do together? What kind of collective power can we establish? Does that mean we contact our representatives? Does that mean we form groups similar to this to address these types of situations until those systems and institutions are there? So I just thought that was a really significant part of our conversation, as well as just understanding the history of the neighborhood, but also how that all plays into macro perspectives as well, not just locally within your neighborhood, but then like we had said, regionally and statewide and nationally, what different narratives play into the way that public safety is viewed and the institutions we have at the moment.
Our group pretty much sort of talked about the robbery as well. And we really talked about several things. On one hand, we're saying abolish the police, right? On the other hand, Aloyla had to call the police. When she did that, they didn't come. Now, was it dangerous for her to follow them? Yes, that was dangerous. But at some point, what else could she have done to get her own description of them? Because at the very least, she now can tell her neighbors what they look like, for the most part, what they were wearing that day. But when she does call the police and they're not going to show up, and then they're going to have the attitude that they had when she spoke with them. Yes. Was she angry? Absolutely. Was she frustrated? Yeah. Did she have a right to be? Absolutely. Yes. You're on my property. And so we have to get to a point where we're having these conversations, but we got to move beyond these conversations. These conversations, there's levels to this. So we move from here. Now we have to come together as neighbors. We all need to write letters from this issue, this incident right here. We all need to write letters. We all need to speak up and speak out, because one of our neighbors, she happens to be my friend, but that's our neighbor. And if it's happening to her, it can happen to you. And to be honest with you, we kind of know who they were, sort of, and where they came from. That's not even the point. The point is, that's not the point. When you call the police, it should be answered. And when you move beyond calling the police and call your leaders, your local leaders, you should receive a phone call. Someone should respond. So that's problematic, and we have to quit sitting here talking about what are we going to do. We've got to do something. What we can do today is each one of us can write letters at the very least about this one incident that we know about. And why do we know about it? Because the person is present. We can't just sit here and go, oh, I'm sorry that happened to you. We got to go beyond that. So that's what I would like to see us do.
I'm putting Cam Gordon's email in the chat as we speak.
And just so you know, I don't even know why I followed them. It just seemed to be something I did.
Mm-hmm.
So I just would want to chime in and say, and this is not me trying to solve Prospects, Parks, or what Aloyla experienced issue. I just actually now want to put on my attendee hat and share a perspective, which is, I think that our public servants, people who raise their hand and say, I'm going to go into elected office, they do so with a lot of sometimes good intention, not necessarily malice, but 100% inability to change the systems that 400 years have birthed. And this is me saying that I certainly always encourage our community to write a letter and make a phone call. And yet I know that there may not be a lot on the end of that because the budget for 2021 has been baked, the systems are in place, and then that could lead to more frustration than not. And yet that's not me saying that I wouldn't encourage you to do it. It's going into it with a sober lens on what could occur. And I think that part of it for me, just as we attempted today to bring forward an idea about how you can begin to think about what you can change, there is some opportunities with respect to neighborhood associations, as an example, thinking through how do we help broker lower cost property insurance, or if there's still, we don't as a neighborhood association have NRP funds, but what would it ever look like for a neighborhood association to either fundraise and or use existing resources to provide an offset against premiums for property insurance so that the items that potentially are lost through the burglaries that we know that are going to happen can actually be replaced. Part of, I think, what happened, which I love what Aloyda has demonstrated with her transparency and her honesty, is she said, listen, I don't know why I followed them. And this is part of what me and Grace was trying to encourage you to do before you're in her same situation, is to figure out your triggers so you know why you would follow somebody. Why would you do that? And that's not an indictment or a judgment, because you just might get to the space where you say, if this happens to me, I'm going to do what Aloyda did, and I'm going to follow that person or group and incur the potential risks because that's what's important to me. Part of it is you understanding why you would behave in a certain way before you need to behave in that way. The other part that I'm offering is that elected leaders, they will only and can only do so much. But I think the through line for me here is constantly bringing their attention to the inefficiencies that are in the system. And even when we're calling collectively for significant, creative, if not, dare I say, radical change, that doesn't mean we want the wheels to fall off the bus with what we got. That doesn't mean that until the new system is created, then we don't need any response, any support until the new system is figured out. On the one hand, you can fully get credit for having conversations about transforming public safety. And on the other hand, I'm going to push you to use your current budget to ensure that there's enough resources in the right places so that certain communities don't constantly bear the brunt of what the inefficiencies have been created over decades.
And I could tell you that in reflection, I likely followed them because I believed, as I was talking to her 911, even putting my boot and coats on, I believed the police were on their way. And I do know that this is not just settled for me. This is not like move on. I am going to proceed, whatever that means, and bring it to whoever's attention. Because I am tired of also my neighbors saying, oh, well, good luck with that. They're never going to respond. Whether it's through my elected official, whether it's through the Prospect Park Association, because guess what? I'm sick and tired. Bull monkey. Prospect Park is going to listen to me. And I'm going to take up time at their next meeting. And I don't know, do I have a right to get a video or a recording or a transcript of that 911 call? It's like, if this is what's happening, it's kind of scary. And just transparency, you know, that Citizens app, I learned about it since this burglary. My neighbor did, as I was coming back to my house, my neighbor was at my front lawn because his wife had called him teaching from home. He told his class no more and he ran over to see if I was okay. So I do want to share that happened.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, it was like, you show up and the police don't.
I love the idea that like, all of this brings up, going off of Tabitha, what you said, and I don't know what everyone said really. There's so much what we turn to these institutions that don't do their job and don't support us, whether it's the police or elected officials, and thinking about just that phrasing of like, what can, I'm not saying anything, this is stupid. When we turn to someone and they don't do anything, that opens up the possibility of these are the things that we can do. when our elected officials aren't responding immediately, we can look to our neighborhood organization and say, this is what our, like, this isn't going to ever happen on this public level, even though it should. And we can also start to make that happen here, even if it is a less funded and smaller scale response. I don't know if I made a single coherent sentence in what I just said, but I'm thinking about stuff.
I think one thing that bears noting on communicating to the people who make decisions, or I guess who make decisions, is that it's kind of a numbers game. When one person calls and says, this is my experience and this was unsatisfactory, they might listen, they might nod their head and go, okay, sorry, lady, blah, blah, blah. But when 20 people call and say there's been poor service in for my neighbors, 20 people, it's a numbers game. What they do in Cam Gordon's office is they just check off how many people called about this issue, how many people called about that issue. Same with the mayor's office. Same with the White House, like I don't know if they used to keep track of it, but they do keep track of who calls about what. And it turns into a numbers game. So when we get numbers, we at least maybe can get heard. If everyone calls in, emails, whatever.
I just want to say, Lloyd, it was just really terrible what happened to you. And I really appreciate your honesty in sharing what you went through. It's really hard to see how just really, I can just feel the emotion, I would feel sort of as a combination of anger and fear. And it makes complete sense to me why you'd follow someone when you're sort of in the heat of all that emotion and you're on the phone, you think someone's coming and you're just thinking something's going to happen. And so it makes sense. I mean, I know sort of on an emotional level, and it's like I just really feel for you, and I feel the anger, and thank you for sharing it. Really, really grateful that you're here today and that you came to this session and shared your story.
That's rough.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
I've got to exit here, but I wanted to thank Grace and Maggie and Tabitha for the wonderful presentation, and it was great to be with you folks, and we'll see you next Wednesday. Take good care.
Thank you, Richard. I do want to also thank those in the chat that shared their own story about being robbed violently. So I know it can be really difficult to be this vulnerable, especially in these weird virtual settings. So I really want to thank you all for your authenticity, and also very grateful that you all are here. In response to, and I know this is one incident, but obviously it had a large impact, and we want to support our neighbors. Can we all pledge today that we will contact Cam Gordon about this issue? Since it sounds, yes, Kathy, you made the numbers game very clear. So we can make this a regular occurrence as well. If we hear about something happening to our neighbors, we reach out to each other and let everyone know, and ensure that we have that collective power to reach out. So I will reach out to Cam Gordon after this meeting.
I appreciate that, Maggie, because I did reach out to him. We chatted, and he's supposed to follow up with me. I have not heard from him regarding that follow-up.
It came up in the PPA meeting too, Aloyda. So just
and Lynn might, Cam is working on it. I just want you to know that Aloyda, Lynn, that is something that he's working diligently on, and he will get back in touch with us or you, Aloyda. So it's definitely not being ignored. I just want you to know that.
I appreciate it, Brett. Thank you.
And when he gets 20 calls, he can say to the people that he's trying to arm twist, I have 20 people on my back about this.
Yeah.
And he's not lying.
Kathy and Britt, where do you both work?
Oh, me?
Yeah, both of you, yeah.
I'm a retired bio teacher from St. Paul Public Schools, and newly retired. So I'm just kind of like, what do I do?
And as I said, I'm the vice president here at Prospect Park Associations, and I do Indigenous health all around the community and around the world now because of Kathy Sledge. I now have my program everywhere. It's in Japan, it's all over the place. So that's what I do.
Amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Perfect. Are there any direct questions for Grace and Tabitha? Otherwise, we can give you 15 minutes of your day back.
I want to say one thing. I just want to say hi, Tabitha. I haven't seen her in a while. We work on an initiative together, so I was just happy to see you. And I'm going to be emailing you soon. Okay.
I would love that, Britt. So good to see your face, and that doesn't mean it's not good to see everyone else's faces, but good to see you.
Thank you, everyone.
Wonderful. Well, we can wrap up. Thank you all for coming. Appreciate you so much. And we will all be in touch.
This was just really outstanding. Thank you, Tabitha. This is the third time I've actually heard you speak, and you just always really do a phenomenal job. And you too, Grace. Thank you both so much. Really outstanding. I would just love it if everyone could hear this talk today. It prompted wonderful discussions, and things have changed because you were here today amongst those that are here. It's clear to me that things will happen differently. So thank you so much.
And there's lots to work on.
That is extremely generous. I am grateful to hear that. Grace makes me look extremely good. And so does all the other staff members over at PPNA. We are grateful and humbled to be asked. So thank you.
Thank you. All right, let's leave inspired. Thanks, everybody.